Welcome back to the study of Daniel. We've made our way up to chapter 11, which contains a very dense and detailed prophecy for the end times. In this video, we're going to examine how this prophecy very explicitly foretells history. Now, the context of Daniel chapter 11 actually begins in chapter 10. Recall that Daniel has had a vision of Jesus. A messenger whom we suspect to be Gabriel was resisted by the supernatural prince of Persia for 21 days as he was attempting to break through from the heavenly realms into the earthly realm to bring Daniel this very message that we're going to study today. The messenger came to reveal that which is noted in the scripture of truth. Well, what's revealed and detailed in Daniel 11 and 12 is that which is noted in the scripture of truth. A vision of Jesus is going to bookend this revelation. Daniel sees Jesus in chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, and then he's going to describe him again lifted up over a river in chapter 12, verse 7. So that framework helps us to understand that this entire prophecy goes together, though it spans a couple of chapters. Daniel 11, as we're going to see, is consistent with Daniel chapter 2, or Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great metal statue, which reveals a timeline from Babylon all the way to the second coming of Christ, or the rock kingdom. It's consistent also with Daniel 7, where he has a vision of 4 beasts, great empires ruling over the earth until the time of the end. Daniel 11 is consistent specifically with Daniel chapter 8, his vision of the ram and he-goat, as we'll detail in this video. And it's also consistent with the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9. However, the information in chapter 7 is not cloaked in imagery and symbolism. It's very explicit and forthright, yet it is still pretty complicated and dense. Now, FYI, Daniel 10 and 12 are very similar to Revelation 10 and 12 respectively. So if you read all of those chapters together, you're certainly going to see some correlation. Now, traditionally, Daniel has been divided up into 4 main sections, and we're going to consider this outline, and then at the end of the video, we're going to reconsider this outline. Part 1 goes from Daniel 11 verses 2 through 20, and it measures the time from Darius of Persia to Antiochus Epiphanes, a Greek king. Then the second portion goes from verse 21 to 32. It goes from a vile person, who many interpret to be Antiochus Epiphanes, and the time of the Maccabees. Then verses 33 to 35, just a few verses there, represent a transition from the ancient historical times up to modern day times, up to the time we're living in now, to the end times, or the time just before the return of Christ. And then part 4, verses 36 to 45, detail the career of someone who's called the willful king, also the king of the north. So again, this is a traditional historical interpretation that you can find in many commentaries, and we're going to consider why this is an excellent way to divide up Daniel. However, at the end of the video, we're going to come back and reconsider the fact that verses 21 through 45 may all apply to the Antichrist. Now, we have been talking about the double chiastic structure of Daniel as we have been going through this study. And as you can see, chapter 11 is parallel to chapter 8. Recall that Daniel 8 encodes the struggle between Persia and Greece, or the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, with the imagery of the ram and the he-goat. That's going to be very important to our interpretation of chapter 11, which once again is parallel to chapter 8 in this double chiastic structure. Daniel 11 is going to reveal the struggle between the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south in a very literal way. So the prophecy of the ram and he-goat enlightens our interpretation of Daniel 11, and we will explore those details for sure. Let's go ahead and consider each of the 4 portions of that main outline individually. The first portion, which runs from verse 2 to verse 20, spans the time from Darius to Antiochus Epiphanes, a Greek king. Once again, Daniel 8 and 11 are parallel and they inform each other. So let's review a little bit of what we learned in Daniel chapter 8. Recall that the he-goat or the shaggy goat represented Greece and the two-horned ram represented Persia. So there's a clash between the ram and the he-goat. We looked at how that represents Greece transplanting Persia as the empire, just as the chest of silver transitions into the belly and thighs of brass. Now, on the he-goat, there was a prominent horn, and that prominent horn was broken off, and then 4 horns replaced it. So many interpret the prominent horn to represent Alexander the Great, and after his death, his kingdom was divided towards the 4 winds of heaven. You've got the Seleucid kings in the north, the Ptolemaic kings in the south, and Cassander and Lysimachus taking portions in the east and west of the empire of Greece. Out of one of those horns arises a little horn. We're going to consider how the little horn is parallel to the king of the north detailed in Daniel 11. Now, Daniel 11 focuses on 2 of those horns, the kings of the north in Syria, or the Seleucid kings, and the kings of the south in Egypt, or the Ptolemaic kings. Various conquests, battles, wars, successes, and defeats are delineated in this passage. Betrayals, marriages, corruption, taxation, and policies are very specifically foretold. Throughout the passage, the kings of the north and the south are constantly in conflict, seeking to expand their territory and control. Israel, in the meantime, is trapped in the middle. Now, I highly recommend the book of Daniel by Clarence Larkin from 1929, where he goes verse by verse through Daniel 11 and matches it up with historical events. It's really quite fascinating. Now let's go ahead and look at the second main division in the overall outline of Daniel. This section spans from verse 21 to 32. It begins in verse 21 with a vile person who obtains the kingdom by flatteries and comes in peaceably. Many commentators suggest that this vile person points to Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, this historical interpretation suggests that the vile person is distinct from the willful king or the Antichrist as described in verse 36. Under Antiochus Epiphanes' reign, the high priest Onias III was murdered. Perhaps this is why the Prince of the Covenant is referred to in Daniel 11:22. In addition, Antiochus Epiphanes accepted a bribe to appoint a non-Levite Jason as the high priest. Daniel 11:22 describes a deceitful league with this vile person. Antiochus Epiphanes attempted to conquer the southern kingdom of Egypt in order to secure control over Israel, as described in verses 25 through 27. He vented his fury of unsuccess on Israel, referred to as the Holy Covenant or the people of the Holy Covenant, in verses 28 through 30. Now, we know that Antiochus Epiphanes outlawed Torah and circumcision. He required pagan sacrifices, and he was a bloody and ruthless king. He tortured people in public, and it was a very trying and troublous time for the Jews. Now, let's go ahead and read Daniel 11:31 towards the end of this division. It says, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." So this says that the army of this vile person will stop the sacrifice or take away the daily sacrifice and place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now, we know that Antiochus Epiphanes' army put a stop to the temple sacrifices. They set up an idol altar and also sacrificed a pig, which is an unclean and detestable animal, in the Jewish temple. Daniel 11:31 is referring to the abomination of desolation. Now, the abomination of desolation is a critical moment in eschatology. What's happening with the vile person in Daniel 11:31 is reminiscent of what we learned about in the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel 9:27. Recall that it says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. So the one who confirms the covenant causes the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And then there is an overspreading of abominations. Now, if we are applying Daniel 11:31 and the prophecy of the vile person in the abomination of desolation to Antiochus Epiphanes, then it is distinct from what's being described in Daniel 9:27. And the reason for that is because the timeline associated with the 70 weeks overshoots the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So either they are talking about two different things, or Daniel 11:31 is referring to someone other than simply Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, Jesus confirms this timing in his Olivet Discourse, placing the abomination of desolation in his future. In Matthew 24:15, Jesus says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," then he says, get out of town. Don't stop and go back and get your possessions, but you have to leave town immediately and with great haste, because the great tribulation, the time of trouble, unmatched since the beginning of the world, is coming at that moment. So the two situations look very similar. Stopping the sacrifice and placing the abomination of desolation. The vile person and his army did this, and yes, it appears to be Antiochus Epiphanes, yet Jesus places this critical event in the future. So we're going to come back and revisit this concept towards the end of this video. Now, let's continue looking at this second main division, this traditional outline of Daniel, from the vile person to the abomination of desolation, and how it could possibly point to the time of the Maccabees. This time period is well documented in 1st and 2nd Maccabees in the history of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. A family headed by the patriarch Mattathias, a priest, initiates a revolt against the unjust government, and they do exploits, as Daniel 11:32 seems to indicate. Mattathias had 3 sons, Judas, Jonathan, and Simon. Judas was nicknamed the Hammer, which is the meaning of the word Maccabees. Mattathias also had a grandson. His name was John Hyrcanus. This family together creates the Hasmonean dynasty, or the Maccabees, and they maintain control until Mark Antony appoints Herod the Great. Herod the Great at first seemed to be a great friend of the Jews. However, he was the one who attempted to murder Jesus by issuing the decree that all boys under the age of 2 should be slain. So Daniel 11:21-32 spans this intertestamental period, which many popularly interpret as representing the time of Antiochus Epiphanes up to Christ. Now, after that division comes division 3, the transition. The 3 short verses from Daniel 11:33-35 represent a time period of more than 2,000 years. So let's see how this third division fits into the context of the overall outline of Daniel. The first 2 divisions of Daniel, from verses 2-32, record the history of the Holy Land from Darius up to this vile person, often interpreted to be Antiochus Epiphanes, during the time of the Maccabees to Herod the Great. After that historical time, Daniel 11:33-35 says that many will fall by the sword and flame and captivity and spoil for many days. This will last until the time of the end. It is yet for a time appointed. So after the time of Christ, the nation of Israel went into a greater exile, the diaspora to the ends of the earth. Israel was non-existent as a nation for thousands of years. It is only recently that they have been regathered and placed into the land as a nation. So they have experienced persecution. They have experienced hardships that we can't imagine. They have been through the Holocaust and other tragedies. Yet the Lord has regathered them and replaced them back in their original land. So this brief passage, verses 33-35 in Daniel 11, is describing that time. After this transition comes the fourth main division, Daniel 11:36-45, detailing the willful king or the king of the north, who very clearly points to the Antichrist. Now, this gap in the prophecy from antiquity to modern times to the end has also occurred before in Daniel chapter 9. Recall in the prophecy of the 70 weeks, we considered the first 69 weeks leading up to the triumphal entry of Christ, and it was during this 69 weeks that the exiles returned after the Babylonian captivity. They rebuilt that second temple, they rebuilt Jerusalem and specifically the wall, and it was very tumultuous and troublous times. After those 69 weeks, there's a break between the 69th week and the 70th week, which represents our current time period. It was during this time period that Jesus was crucified on the cross. The second temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Once again, Israel was dispersed to the ends of the earth, and many refer to this as the church age, or the time that the fullness of the Gentiles is to be come in. We've experienced in this gap between the 69th and 70th week, the rebirth of Israel in 1948. Then the timeline resumes in the 70th week, with the confirmation of the covenant with many. It is at that time that the one who confirms the covenant will put a stop to the sacrifices. Then the abomination that maketh desolate, as we've been talking about and considering in Daniel 11:31, that's in the midst of the 70th week, and that lasts till the final destruction, until the wrath is completely poured out. So once again, the point is that this transition period in Daniel chapter 11 is not unprecedented. There's a break in the 70-week timeline after the 69 weeks and before the 70th week. That gap, just a few words, just one verse in Daniel chapter 9 represents more than 2,000 years. So the 3 verses in Daniel 11:33-35 is fulfilling a similar purpose. Now, the final division of the outline of Daniel goes from verse 36 to 45, and it records the career and conquest of the willful king. The willful king is also referred to as the king of the north in this passage. Now, what I want to do is take a little bit of time to show you that the willful king has similar characteristics to the little horn on Daniel's fourth beast in Daniel chapter 7. He also is very similar to the little horn on the he-goat in Daniel chapter 8. That little horn was also referred to as a king of fierce countenance. In Daniel 11, he's described as the willful king or the king of the north. He also has similar characteristics to the beast from the sea in Revelation 13, and the one whom Paul describes as the son of perdition or that wicked in 2 Thessalonians 2. So on this very detailed chart, I've got all of those references to the willful king. Okay, in the first column over here, we're going to consider the context for each of these situations, his opponent, his source of power, what it says about peace, his power over the saints, time of his reign, and his destruction. And we're going to compare the little horn on the fourth beast of Daniel 7 to the little horn on the he-goat of Daniel 8, or the king of fierce countenance, to the willful king, the king of the north, the focus of this study, Daniel 11, to the beast from the sea in Revelation 13, to the Apostle Paul's description of the man of sin, the son of perdition, or that wicked in 2 Thessalonians 2. So all of these have parallels, and in my opinion, they're pointing to the same person, to the Antichrist. The little horn on Daniel's fourth beast, recall, arises among 10 horns, uprooting 3. Remember, the 10 horns on Daniel's fourth beast were parallel to the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's statue. Remember, it was during the time of the toes that the rock not cut out with human hands comes and smashes the statue and becomes a great mountain filling the whole earth. That rock is Christ. That rock represents his millennial kingdom. So because the time of the 10 toes is pointing to the time just before the return of Christ, we know that the 10 horns on Daniel's fourth beast are also pointing to the time of the end. A little horn arises amongst those 10 horns, and again, this is during the time of the end. The little horn on the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8 is described as occurring at the time of the end. That is repeated over and over and over in Daniel 8:17, 19, 23, and 26. Now, the willful king comes in our outline after many days and also at the time of the end or the time appointed. The beast from the sea in Revelation 13, remember he's described as having 7 heads and 10 horns and 10 crowns. This makes him distinct from the beast in Revelation 17, who only has 7 heads and 10 horns. Crowns are not mentioned. So because the 10 crowns are mentioned on the beast from the sea in Revelation 13, this is the time that the 10 kings have power. The 10 toes are in play. The 10 horns on Daniel's fourth beast are in play. The 10 horns of the beast in Revelation 17 have been crowned in Revelation 13. And finally, the man of sin, the son of perdition, or that wicked, as the Apostle Paul refers to him in 2 Thessalonians 2, he's talking about the day of Christ. So all of those references are pointing to the time of the end. And when I say the time of the end, I'm referring to the time before the return of Christ. Jesus will come back to the earth, he will set up his millennial kingdom, and he will reign from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. Now, each of these individuals has a specific opponent. If we compare the components, we can see the similarities between the horns and the beasts and the kings, okay? The little horn on Daniel's fourth beast has a mouth speaking great things, and he speaks words against the Most High. So clearly the little horn amongst the 10 horns on Daniel's fourth beast is speaking against God, referred to as the Most High. The little horn on the he-goat magnifies himself to the prince of the host. And remember, we really examined that phrase, prince of the host, how it points to Jesus, how it points to the angel of the Lord, the commander of the Lord's host that Joshua sees before he enters the Holy Land. The prince of the host is Jesus himself. Also in Daniel 8:25, the little horn stands up against the prince of princes. Now, this willful king that we're considering in Daniel 11 speaks against the God of gods. So look, the Most High, the Prince of the host, the Prince of princes, the God of gods, it's all referring to this power speaking against God himself. The beast from the sea in Revelation 13 is no different. He has names on his heads that are the names of blasphemy, and he has a mouth speaking great things and blasphemy against God. It's very clear there that he considers God to be his enemy. And Paul's man of sin, the son of perdition, exalts himself above God and claims to be God. So all of those descriptions, the little horns, the kings, the beast, they are all referring to the time of the end, and they assert themselves against the Most High God. Now, consider their source of power. The little horn arises amongst the 10 horns on Daniel's fourth beast, but the little horn of Daniel 8 on the he-goat says that he will be mighty, but not by his own power. So he has power, but he's not deriving it from himself. The willful king, or the king of the north, in Daniel 11, it says that he honors a God of forces and he acknowledges a strange God. It says he will not worship the God of his fathers, but he honors a God of forces, of might, of military, of force, and he acknowledges a strange God. Now, very specifically in Revelation 13, the beast from the sea derives his power, seat, and great authority from the dragon. The dragon is Satan himself. And this is very similar to Paul's man of sin. He says his coming will be after the working of Satan with deceivableness and signs and lying wonders. So the little horn, the willful king, the beast from the sea, the man of sin, they are deriving their power from Satan, opposing themselves against the Most High God. Now, several of them have passages that refer to a time of peace. The little horn on the he-goat of Daniel 8, in Daniel 8:25, it says, "By peace he will destroy many." The willful king, or the king of the north, in Daniel 11:21, says, "This vile person comes in peaceably and obtains the kingdom by flatteries." Now, I have a little asterisk here because this is not in the fourth division. But as I planted a little doubt in your mind that the vile person only points to Antiochus Epiphanes due to the analysis of the Abomination of Desolation, it's very likely that he's also pointing to the Antichrist. And it says the vile person comes in peaceably. And the Apostle Paul describes the son of perdition, whose power is from Satan. He's opposing himself against God. But in 1 Thessalonians 5:3, Paul says, when they say peace and safety, sudden destruction comes upon them. Recall in Daniel chapter 9, the prophecy of the 70 weeks, it begins with the confirmation of a covenant with many. Because there is a covenant there is an agreement with many. A lot of people call it a peace treaty or a peace agreement. And also we can see the concept of peace in play with these fierce enemies. Each of these kings or entities will exercise power over the saints. The little horn on Daniel's fourth beast among the 10 horns makes war with the saints and prevails. He will wear out the saints of the Most High. The little horn on the he-goat of Daniel 8, it says he destroys wonderfully and will prosper. He will destroy the mighty and holy people. So the little horn, the king of the north, the beast will be successful in waging war against the saints of the Most High. The beast from the sea in Revelation 13:7 is described as making war with the saints and overcoming them. The beast from the sea will exercise power over kindreds, tongues, and nations. In addition, the timing of their reign is related in all of these different cases. The little horn on Daniel's fourth beast is described as ruling for a time, times, and the dividing of time. Remember, that is 1 year, 2 years, and half a year. Remember, in Hebrew, there's a singular, a dual. So you've got 1 year, 2 years, and half a year. So 3.5 years for the little horn of Daniel's fourth beast. In addition, the little horn on the he-goat of Daniel 8 is associated with this timeline of 2,300 days. Recall in Daniel 8, it says from the time of the daily and the abomination and the trampling to the cleansing, there will be 2,300 days. So those 2,300 days keep that 70th week together as one unit because it starts from the removal of the daily, spans across the abomination, lasts through the trampling, the war, the success over the saints until the cleansing. The willful king, or the king of the north, is described as having power for time, times, and half a time. Now, that doesn't occur until Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. But recall, the revelation from Daniel 10 to Daniel 12 is one prophecy bookended by the appearance of Christ on either side. So the willful king, whose description continues into chapter 12, is described as having power for a time, times, and half a time. Same as the little horn on Daniel's fourth beast. Finally, the beast from the sea of Revelation 13 has power for 42 months. That's also 3.5 years. So we can see some definite similarities across the board in all of these different descriptions of the end time enemy, including his final destruction. The little horn of Daniel's fourth beast has his body slain and given to the blazing fire. The little horn of the he-goat in Daniel 8 is destroyed without hand. That's a supernatural destruction, a judgment of God. The willful king, or the king of the north, in Daniel 11:45, it says he will come to his end and none shall help him. The beast from the sea is cast alive into the lake of fire. That harkens back to what happens in Daniel 7 to the little horn of Daniel's fourth beast. And finally, Paul describes about the man of sin, the son of perdition, that he will be consumed with the spirit of the Lord's mouth and destroyed supernaturally by the brightness of his coming. He's like a vampire exposed to the sunlight. He can't stand, he can't exist in the presence of a holy God. So because of all of these similarities, and there are more, this is just what I fit into one screen, because of the context, that is the time of the end, the opponent is the Most High God, the source of power is Satan. This is associated with a time of false peace. The enemy will take power over the saints, make war, and be successful in trampling the saints. The time of the reign is a time, times, and half a time, or 42 months. Yet this enemy will come to a final supernatural destruction by a judgment of God. So the little horn of Daniel's fourth beast, the little horn of the he-goat in Daniel 8, the willful king, the king of the north that we're reading about in Daniel 11, the beast from the sea in Revelation 13, the man of sin or son of perdition that the Apostle Paul describes in 2 Thessalonians 2, it's all describing the same final cataclysmic culminating event of history. It's no wonder that all of the prophets are so consistent, because they're talking about a time of unmatched trouble that occurs just before the return of Christ. So at this time, we have examined the individual details of the four main divisions of the outline of Daniel chapter 11. This is the common historical interpretation. However, in examining the vile person and the events with the abomination of desolation in the second main division, it's possible that Daniel 11:21 through 45 may all apply to the Antichrist, not Antiochus Epiphanes. The abomination of desolation is the key. Let's look at all of the verses in Daniel and elsewhere referring to the abomination of desolation. Today we looked at Daniel 11:31 regarding the vile person in the second division of the common outline. It says, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice and place the abomination that maketh desolate." So the armies of the vile person take away the daily and place the abomination. In Daniel 12:11, the abomination is used to count the time to the end, the resurrection, the return of Christ, the time just before the millennial reign. It's in the context of the end, not in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Daniel 12:11 says that from the time the daily sacrifice shall be taken away and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there will be 1,290 days. So we'll talk about that time period in another video. But look, the daily sacrifice is removed and the abomination is set up. This is exactly what's described of the vile person in Daniel 11:31. This was also true of the little horn in Daniel 8:11. It says, "He magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down." So the little horn of Daniel 8 removes the daily, and we've looked at the connection between the little horn and all the other descriptions for the Antichrist. Daniel 8:13, remember, the abomination is included in the 2300 days prophecy. It says, "Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the transgression of desolation," it's described a little differently there, "to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." So remember, in the prophecy of the 2,300 days, It goes from the daily, across the transgression of desolation, through the trampling to the cleansing. So it spans across from the daily, across the transgression of desolation to the cleansing, the time of the end. Remember, one of the points of Daniel's 70 weeks is that the most holy be anointed, the most holy place be anointed. It has to be cleansed in order to be anointed. Daniel 9:27, the prince that shall come, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So the 70th week lasts to the end. In the midst of the 70th week is the abomination of desolation, and at the end, the beast is destroyed, Jesus returns and sets up his kingdom. And this abomination of desolation, remember, Jesus put it in his future, not his past, where Antiochus Epiphanes was. He says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, get out of town, right? And that's repeated again in Mark 13:14. So what do all of these references have in common? The removal of the daily, the placement of the abomination of desolation, spanning until the time of the end. So the context is the end. So it's likely that the vile person has a shadow fulfillment in Antiochus Epiphanes, but points to a greater fulfillment in the Antichrist, the beast of Revelation 13, the little horn on Daniel's fourth beast, the little horn on the he-goat, the willful king of Daniel 11, the king of the north, the king of fierce countenance, the son of perdition, the man of sin. Now, if that is true, then we should also consider Daniel 8. We were looking at the ram with 2 horns as pointing to the Medo-Persian kingdom, the he-goat that starts with a prominent horn that's broken off, replaced by 4 horns, and then a little horn grows up, pointing to Greece. It is definitely parallel to what we can see from Daniel's fourth beast, but it also might be pointing forward to the time of the end. Remember, if what we're seeing in Daniel 11 is pointing to the time of the end, and it's parallel to what's going on in Daniel 8, then it's also very likely that these are end times beasts. So, should we watch for a Turkish invasion of Iran? It's definitely a possibility. So that was a very detailed lesson. I hope that you learned something. In the next lesson, we're going to look at more details of the King of the North and other texts in Scripture that refer to him specifically in his career and conquest. And so I just want to say thank you for listening. Hope you have a great day.